All right, boys and girls, we come to the conclusion of our study, and we have just 1 week to look at the 10th commandment. The 10th commandment is, for all intents and purposes, a summation, a review, or even a citing back to the first commandment. And they both are encompassed. In fact, all of the commandments are encompassed in Jesus' words that our responsibility is to love the Lord with all our heart, mind, soul, and strength. When we are called to do that, we realize that there is nothing outside of that. Our own opinions have to be subjected to God. Our desires have to be submitted to Christ and to the Word and to the sense of righteousness that He calls us to. There is so much involved in discipleship and growth that we are to take charge of and to take stock of, and to be aware that there isn't any part of life that's left out. Now, the 10th commandment, just a little bit of background. This shadow, by the way, is here, but it won't be online. The little bit of background as to the numbering again. We talked about this at the beginning. There is a difference in the way that these commandments are numbered, depending on what your tradition or background is. Roman Catholics and Lutherans actually number the commandments differently than the Protestants do, and the background of that goes all the way back to the 7th Ecumenical Council, which was 8th century, when the battle was hard fought for iconography. And the church went back and forth as to the question, can we have images in worship? Can we have, a crucifix on the wall? Can we portray Mary? Can we worship? Can we pray to saints? Can there be spots where portraits of saints are acceptable in the church building? And excuse me, this went back and forth. And finally, in the 7th Ecumenical Council, they declared that the icons were just fine. That was okay. We are to worship God, and doing so with our vision is quite acceptable. And that led to a lot of hair splitting. Worship versus veneration. What's the difference? Is there a difference? What is acceptable in terms of icons and what is not? Where are they to be? All of that's just opened up with the permissiveness of those things. And one of the things they had to wrestle with was the numbering of the 10 Commandments, because, of course, the second commandment, as we list it, says you are not to make idols. You are not to make idols or worship them, for I, the Lord your God, it goes on. And so they had to wrestle with that. The Roman Catholics decided one of the things that they might do is say, well, we think that what the commandment is talking about there is idols of pagan gods, not idols of the Trinity. So they made a artificial differentiation there. And so that's why they combined it into number 1. You shall have no other gods, and you shall not make idols or icons of other gods. That's kind of how they did that. Well, having done that, then they realized, well, we've only got 9 commandments now, and that doesn't work. Got to have 10. And so they took a look at the difference in the recording of the Exodus 20 listing of the 10 Commandments and the Deuteronomy 5 listing of the 10 Commandments. And they noticed that in the Deuteronomy 5, in fact, let me just get that up for you. When you put them side by side, you'll notice that, there it is, that in Exodus it starts with, you shall not covet your neighbor's house. And then it says, you shall not covet your neighbor's wife. In Deuteronomy it says, you shall not covet your neighbor's wife. And then you should not covet your neighbor's house. And they said, well, wife is more important than house. And so we'll go with Deuteronomy 5. And furthermore, it repeats the commandment. It says, you shall not, and then again, you shall not. It says it twice. It doesn't do that any other time. So they felt justified in saying, wait, we have here 2 commandments. and wife should take precedence. There you go. And so they said, you shall not covet your neighbor's wife would be number 9. And then number 10 would be you shall not covet anything else your neighbor has. And then they would bring in the reinforcement for that. Well, marriage is a big deal, and the commandment not to commit adultery is reinforces this, and so there was a great rationalization for that. And so that was that is the argumentation for this. And you can see that that's all in defense of allowing for statues, which of course is inappropriate because the Bible is very clear about golden calf being the first of those episodes. Building anything as an idol of anything, whether it's in heaven above or in the earth or in the waters under the earth. No idols, no created idols are to be made and worshipped, and there is no distinction between the Trinity and a pagan group. So we do notice that difference. That is the only difference. Is it a problem? Is it a question? Is it a concern for us that Deuteronomy 5 does repeat the "you shall not"? But I don't think that it has any, as far as linguistics go, I don't think that has any bearing on causing distinctions or separation of commandments or listing out. The priorities are very important for those things. So the last commandment is all-encompassing. And the New Testament reinforces that when you read from Romans chapter 7 and 13. What then shall we say? That the law is sin? By no means. Yet if it had not been for the law, I would not have known sin, for I would not have known what it is to covet. Doesn't say covet what, just covet, period. If the law had not said, you shall not covet, but sin, seizing the opportunity through commandment, produced in me all kinds of covetousness. So there is no distinction according to priority or according to value or according to humankind, or there's no, coveting this is different than coveting that. Paul makes no distinction. Then in Romans 13 he does the same thing. Owe no one anything except to love each other, for the one who loves another has fulfilled the law. For the commandments, you shall not commit adultery, you shall not murder, you shall not steal, you shall not covet, period. And any other commandment are summed up in the words, you shall love your neighbor as yourself. And so, again, coveting is the single commandment that concludes the list of 10, and there's no distinction that is appropriately to be made. Now, the one thing that I do notice about the 10th commandment is it seems to go right into the application. You shall not covet your neighbor's house or wife first, whichever you refer to. You shall not covet anything else that belongs to your neighbor. And that's usually regarded as the application of the commandment. It's missing, for instance, just the straightforward nature of the commandment. You shall not covet. And that would have made it easy it would have ended all of the discussion if that had been the case. But it kind of, if we line it up with how the 4th commandment is expressed, we see that it does refer to the all-encompassing nature of worshiping God with all of our heart, mind, soul, and strength, because it reminds us of the 1st commandment, kind of in parallel with the way the 4th commandment is listed. The commandment is first, remember the Sabbath day. Then there is the elaboration, 6 days you shall labor, and the application follows. So if we line up the 1st commandment as the real command here, whereas in the 1st commandment it's in the positive, I am the Lord your God. In the negative, you shall not desire anything else in the world. And then the explanation for that comes from the 2nd commandment. You shall not make for yourself a carved image. You shall not bow down to them or serve them. For I, the Lord your God, am a jealous God. So if we were to elaborate, if we were to bring the fullness of this commandment in, it would follow that kind of pattern. Now, the 10 commandments, the point about the 10 commandments as a whole is that they sum up the sins of the heart. And we've noticed that The Pharisees in Jesus' day reduced obedience of the commandments to merely the outward acts. And Jesus was speaking directly to them when he said again and again and again that no, it's not merely the outward acts, it's the thought, it's the sins of the heart that is always at focus. And so when we look at the way that the 10th commandment would line up in that regard, we know that our sinful desire, first and foremost, is not to be accountable to God in anything. We want to throw God's rule and authority off in all of these areas of life. We might want to, as I say, like a Pharisee, we might want to formally acknowledge, tip our hat to, pretend to worship God, but we always do it on our terms. We do it because this is how much I will give God. This is how much of God's obedience I will regard as important. And so we're always dealing with the sinful nature in our hearts in even the way we respond to God. We can say we love Him with all of our heart, mind, soul, and strength, but then there's the exceptions over here, and there's the issues over here that we compromise and things. And so the first object of the 10th commandment is to recognize that sinful nature in our own hearts. Coveting is not a problem, as Paul says in Romans, if there isn't that sinful nature in my heart. But the law points that sinful nature out. It's real, it's there, and it dominates and controls my thinking. And so I have to be ready to acknowledge that first and foremost. Now that's going to separate our way of thinking from the way the world thinks, especially in regards to this. And so just keep that in mind. My sinful desire then is to have and to possess what I want and make it precious to me. So first of all, we have the sinful desire not to be accountable to God. That kind of reminds us of the parable of the rich man with the barns. You remember that it's always an interesting parable to study because the man is portrayed as merely successful. He's a hardworking man. He's enterprising. He brings in a bumper crop. He has many of the profiles of being a man who has been blessed by God. But in response to that, he said he does not have anything that he gives to God or acknowledges to God. Instead, he wants to build bigger barns, and that is what makes him a fool, and that's what condemns him before God. His sinful nature says, this is all what I have done, and I want to provide for myself, and my life will last long, and I will go into retirement. And he says, fool, that this very night your soul is required of you. And so there's no acknowledgement of God in that. He throws off that accountability. And then secondly, our sinful desire to have and to possess what I want and make it precious to me is the all-encompassing desire for things or people or positions of power or anything else that I simply am ravenous to consume and to possess, to control. And we make those things by that energy. We might say, anybody, any successful businessman, anybody we regard as rough and aggressive and fighting his way to the top would just say, well, that's how you play the game. That's what you have to do. This is how you make it ahead. This is how you, and they, the last thing in the world they would acknowledge is that this is an idol to me. And yet, how do we define idols? How do we define worship? We define worship to God according to how much energy we give to Him, how much time we give to Him, how much of our valuable offering we give to Him. We define who we worship by how much of us is consumed by what we worship. I always tell people that. You are consumed, no matter who you are, no matter what you believe, no matter what your God is, you will be consumed by your worship. Now you might, our first foremost thought is to say, well, no, that's true of pagan worship, but not of me because I'm a Christian. But no, you will be consumed by your worship too. If you give all of your energy to building your little empire, bigger barns, what have you, it will consume you. if you give all of your life and all of your self to God, you are like a drink offering being poured out. And when that drink offering is poured out, it is done. Your life is over. You will be consumed by who you worship. So you must choose who it is you will be consumed by. All right. So we are worshiping things in this life, of course, is a dead end, because it will consume us. It will require of us everything we have. And then third, my sinful desire is not to regard my neighbor as myself. I always want to look out for number one. I always care for myself. And what happens to others is not my concern. And so that, and that means that coveting what somebody has to the point of negotiating or manipulating things and politics and other things to get what I want at the expense of someone else is okay. Story of Naboth's vineyard is a very good example of that. The king wanted this vineyard, this prize vineyard that this man Naboth had. We talked about this when we talked about bearing false witness. He wanted this vineyard. He wanted this land. He wanted this for himself. He said, "I'm king. I should deserve it. I should be able to get it." And so he actually ordered two men, to corrupt individuals, to bring false witness to Naboth, accusing him of dreadful things. And he was arrested and tried and executed on their accounts. And the king graciously took charge of this abandoned vineyard. So again, my regard for myself is not something that even comes equal to my regard for my neighbor. So it's the sin in our hearts that is the thing we have to fight and oppose and deal with. And it is the sin in our hearts that the 10th commandment is speaking to us about. It's the sin of the heart that we're dealing with. Now, when it comes to understanding this perspective in the right fashion, I think the story of Ruth is probably an excellent example of this. You might remember how the story of Ruth goes. Naomi and her husband move off to Moab in the midst of a drought. And they have two sons. The two sons get married. They die. Naomi is left with Ruth. These two bereft widows return. They have nothing to themselves, nothing to call their own. They return to Jerusalem out of hope of a new start, a support, what have you. And you remember that Ruth goes out and she begins gleaning in the field. And there's a commandment that God gives to rich people with fields and with laborers, saying you are to leave the corners, you're to leave the stalks that fall and are left behind, and don't go back and pick them up, so that the poor have something to get on their own. Now, that's a good illustration of the structure of the social environment that we are to have and to understand. What do we learn by that? The first thing we learn in that story is that there are rich and there are poor. There are those that have and there are those that have not. And that is a biblical understanding. Now, I'm introducing this because we're going to get into the other views that say, well, we shouldn't have poor. We shouldn't have rich. We should all share. We should all have things in common. And before we get there, I want to say this is what the Bible's perspective on this is. You will have the poor among you. You will have the rich. This is based on the argument of private property that we talked about with one of the other commandments. The rich had the motivation to even be more productive. When you have the resources to put your energy to making even more profit, enlarging your holdings, because you gain by doing that. So there is an industry that is built into the economic system that the Bible demonstrates, and that speaks to our requirement to have dominion over the world, but also to take charge of it and to make the most of it. And when you own those things, when private property is there, you want to do that. You want to develop. You want to increase to the glory of God. You don't want to be like the man with the bigger barns because he didn't recognize God, but you obviously want to. And so that's an important aspect to this. But the rich also had an obligation before the Lord, and when this is given instruction in Exodus, it says, you who are wealthy need to minister to those who do not have, because you also were poor in Egypt. You were enslaved in Egypt, and this is not something that is to be ignored and forgotten by you, so that you feel justified in not helping anybody else. So the rich have an obligation before God, first of all, not to be stingy. It was a commandment to leave the corners and to leave the stalks that fall and not to go back. But of course, in the process of wanting to make the most of your harvest, you'll send the workers back real quick to clean up the corners and to pick up what's left. And the Lord says, no, you are not to do that, because you are to leave that for the poor. And you're not also to be prejudiced or abusive to them. This comes up in the story of Ruth. Ruth goes to do her gleaning, which is her right. But she's met with opposition, and the history and context of such opposition is that the poor might be attacked. If it's a young lady like this, she might be abused. Anytime the poor show up to take what is rightfully theirs, they would have been looked down on and rejected and dismissed. And that attitude also is spoken against. You aren't to abuse the poor. You are not to be prejudiced against them just for who they are. But you are to allow them to work. So that also is part of the world and life view here, that even though there are poor and there are rich, the rich are not to be prejudiced toward the poor, but the poor are not to be lazy. They are to be industrious in their own right, to do what they can to provide for themselves, so that everybody has the call to do work and to be energetic. The poor were then to do what they could to improve themselves. And so the whole story of Ruth is based on that. The whole story, it's based on that worldview understanding of how we are to regard one another socially, and how there will be imbalance, and how the rich are to regard the poor and the poor are to regard the rich. It's all in the structure there of how Scripture's understanding of economics works. So the 10th commandment then reinforces our understanding of private property or boundaries. Now you might say, well, this is what creates envy. You might hear the argument, well, if there was no private property, if we all shared everything like we're supposed to, then wouldn't envy. I would just take what I need and give what somebody else needs, and we would be one big happy family. And history has demonstrated, in various ways, different kinds of communes, different kinds of governments, different kinds of social understandings, whatever you might call them, have been experiments in doing this, where the idea of private property is renounced, and that, and as a result of that, they say there's no envy now, there's no covetousness, because we share everything and we're just one big happy family, and that as a result of that, there isn't any problem. But there is a distinct difference between a biblical community and how that's to be understood, and a socialist or a communal community, and what's presumed in that environment. And the first of those things is that the Judeo-Christian worldview will say we start off with number one thing, and that is that sin resides in the heart. That's the theme of this whole lesson. Sin resides in the heart. And it's only the biblical world and life view that says that, and that's a place to start. Any other view of man will eliminate that right off the bat. No, there's no such thing. We all love each other. There's no problem here, and we all care for one another, and so that's the first thing that's eliminated, and it's the first difference, the first very big difference. Secondly, there is an encouragement of generosity and social responsibility in the biblical community. Talked about that with the story of Ruth. And that's opposed to the obligation that you have in whatever language it's given to you, whichever way it's imposed. No, you do not have private property. That is not your shovel. You must share that with Brother Joe or whatever else you're going to say. You have a required duty to share and not be possessive. So that's an understanding. You have to pool everything together. But in the biblical community, the generosity of what is yours is encouraged. There's a difference. It is mine, but I give it to you freely because I want you to prosper. The biblical community regards the prosperity of the one as opposed to the many. This is always a social debate back and forth. Should we honor what is good for the one as opposed to the many, or should we do work for the good of the many as opposed to the one? And in the socialist or the communal aspect, it's always the many that have the greater priority over the one. The one may have to sacrifice, the one may have to suffer, so that the many benefit. And the biblical perspective is just the opposite. It's the one is critical, and as a result of that, the many will form around that. Yeah, Karen.
Quantity over quality.
Well, yeah, to a certain degree, but yeah. Right. In a larger communal setting, we may decide that this action, this decision, this direction is better for the many. And if there are single people who have issues with that, they're just going to have to adjust or something else. Yeah, Bruce?
I was going to say the family shares that principle. The headship of the man is
Right.
the man.
Yes. It's not meant to be a democratic organization. Yes, that's a good point. The biblical community says to take ownership by way of utilizing, preserving, and protecting what is yours. Again, if you own a bull, if you own a cow or a donkey, and that animal gets out, you will pursue it. You will bring it back safely. You will make sure it's well fed. You'll make sure it's well watered, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. If this is a communal animal, you won't take responsibility for that. You won't. Somebody else will get it. And there is a neglect that becomes primary in people's minds. To love what is yours. This gets right down to some communities' philosophy regarding marriage. That it's argued in the communal side of things that even marrying one person is possessive and inappropriate, because we are all part of one community. We don't have, exclusive rights to one another. They might even argue that treats our potential spouses as things. You claim this person as yours, and you have no right to do that. And so in the more aggressive efforts of this, they would say there is no marriage, there is no commitment to one another. Living in the 60s with the communal aspects of the hippie generation, this was such a big deal that we share everything, and that includes who we have sexual relations with. And everybody is fine with that. And so what kids are born in such a situation, we don't care who the father is. It doesn't matter, because we raise our kids together. We share everything, and including our own bodies. But history has proven that such communal kind of philosophy only really is there because it satisfies the male urge to hunt and to be as permissive and promiscuous as possible. And the woman, starting with the 60s, the woman in communal environments would go along because it seemed like the fun thing to do, and they would wind up being abused, and they would wind up with the short end of the stick, and that led, I think, rather directly to the next phase, and that's feminism, and and the rejection of the male, and the predominance of abortion. Anything other than a biblical worldview does bring out the sin of covetousness in the heart. Yeah, Karen.
Devaluing human life.
Yeah, treating the one side argues, well, we don't want to treat other people as things, and they wind up doing precisely that. Especially, the male is always tempted to look at women as prizes, as trophies, and so they are pursuant of that. The woman in that environment goes along with it and submits because she wants to be accepted, she wants to be loved, she wants to be a part. But then, and lastly, the biblical community is told not to just have, but to honor what belongs to somebody else. So you are to have perfect right to your own private property, which includes your wife in this regard. The commandment says that. It says this is my wife and not yours. And you are also, the flip side of that is you are to honor the relationship that someone else has. You fight any desire in your sinful heart to look at another man's wife and say, with the outward practice of honoring that marriage and holding it up in respect and dealing with it in a proper fashion, because the Bible calls you to do that in a social or a communal setting. Of course, that you have no such call to honor somebody else for what they own or for who they are with, and it encourages instead a very willful possessiveness. Okay?
Yeah, we see that. Love what is yours, and we don't even love our own bodies anymore.
Yeah.
And the distinctiveness of how God made us has evaporated
Yes.
in the communal sense of gender. Social sense.
We've lost a lot of the identity of who we are just by surrendering this. It's amazing how, we're told again and again and again, this is a post-Christian age, and there are less and less people who go to church, who profess to be Christian, who don't have anything to do with any religion at all, and yet, they know in their hearts still what they're doing is sin. Romans 1, you don't need to know everything in the Bible to understand, to demonstrate rather, that you are still living coram Deo, you still are before God in rebellion and in anger and in wrath. And by experimenting in all of these various kinds of ways and bringing that to nothing, you're just destroying that which God has given. So rather than having dominion and bringing a blessing to creation, you are destroying it one piece at a time until it will be all gone. Now, in Jesus' teaching, he underscores the sin of the heart in various ways. In the Sermon on the Mount, he speaks against this. Well, it only applies to outward practice. He says, don't think I've come to abolish the law or the prophets. He says, everyone who is angry with his brother is guilty of murder in that sense. Everyone who looks at a woman with lustful intent is guilty of adultery. He's trying to say the sin in the heart is the thing which you must look to in your own life. 1 Timothy 6 says the love of money is the root of all kinds of evils. It is through this craving that some have wandered away from the faith, pierced themselves with many pangs. So that speaks of the envy of the heart regarding money. And so again and again and again, the scriptures are addressing the sins in the heart, and not just according to what we do on the outside. And so it's understanding that what we read in the Old Testament applies today in this regard. Deuteronomy 6 tells us we shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your might. That leaves nothing out. There isn't any other category of life that is somehow excluded. And saying, well, this doesn't belong to God, this belongs to me. And I can do whatever I want over here because it's not Sunday. Or I'm not around Christians, and therefore I can act as I want. There's nothing outside of the face of God. Proverbs 7 says, keep my commands and live. Keep my teaching as the apple of your eye. Bind them on your fingers. Write them on the tablet of your heart. You might know that Orthodox Jews like to, wrap straps of leather around their wrists, and they have the phylacteries on their foreheads. And they're demonstrating in outward ways their devotion to the literal commandment of God. And that probably speaks to a great deal of devotion that these men have, but it does not guard them from sin of the heart. It does not purge the sin of the heart to put a phylactery on your forehead. And it does the same thing with Christians. We're not thinking, we don't just show up with suit and tie on Sunday morning and think we're just everything a Christian should be, and then go and cheat on this person or lie to that person and think that we are somehow outside of the realm of God's authority. Now that does bring up the question of how far this goes, because we remind ourselves that Jesus, while we are born in sin, and sin is in our hearts, nonetheless, Jesus is born a man, tempted in all ways as we are. Was he therefore sinning in being tempted, having that temptation in his heart? The first thing we have to understand is that temptation itself is common to man. Every single person is going to be tempted by Satan. You think of Jesus, as soon as he was baptized, he went into the wilderness, and for 40 days he battled with Satan, and Satan tempted him, Scripture says. But Jesus did not give in to that temptation, and so being tempted is not the same thing as giving in to sin. And that's an important distinction, although the distinction is not always easy to draw, is it? It's not always easy to draw. What does it mean then to be tempted and not sin? And where does that line fall? Well, for Calvin and some others, he said you can entertain desires. In other words, it doesn't mean receive and play with them. He says temptations can crop up in your mind. You can they will be there, which consolidate into a plan. I look at that woman and I am tempted, and what that yields me is that I give into, rather, is that now I'm going to say, okay, I'm going to, she's going over to the bar. I'm going to go see what drink she's having, so I can go over and nonchalantly buy her another one of those because I know she likes it. We're making a plan for acting on temptation in whatever fashion we might do. And so he says the distinction is that the lustful man plans strategies to take the unlawful woman. He makes those plans in his mind, and then he executes those plans. There are different stages here: being tempted, making a plan, carrying out the plan. The greedy man plans strategies to cheat a neighbor, same thing. I could move his boundary stones without him noticing. I could move it maybe, a couple of yards every year, and he would never notice. And then he decides when he's best likely to carry that out is when his neighbor is away visiting the family. And so he executes the plan. He acts upon it. So temptation is nursing or dwelling on that temptation, nursing and dwelling on that sin, and making a plan to carry that sin out. Those two would fall under the rubric of covet. So when we say, that Jesus was tempted in all ways like we are, he also received those very ideas and notions. Worship me, and you can have all these cities. But to refuse that temptation means not to dwell on it, not to cook up a plan, and then to think about carrying that plan out. The word desire or crave that is used there to talk about envy in the Old Testament is a word that we find in a couple of very well-known areas. The first one is, I'll mention first, is Genesis 4:7. It's a more plainly illustrative case. Cain and Abel, of course, we know the story of Cain and Abel. The implication of right worship was given to them. Abel worshiped God according to the way he was supposed to. Cain decided not to do that, and before he was tempted with anger toward his brother. He might be cooking up a plan, but he had not acted on it yet. The Lord spoke to Cain, you remember, and it says, "If you do well, will you not be accepted? And if you do not do well, sin is crouching at the door." That's the temptation. Sin is crouching at the door. Its desire is for you. So the word there is translated desire. The temptation, it wants to consume you. Remember what worship is. But you must rule over it. You must oppose it. You must push it off. That's what the commandment says. The temptation is there. It wants to rule you. You must push it off. You must reject it completely. Now, interestingly enough, back in Genesis 3:16, in the midst of the curse of God upon the woman, the same word is used, desire or crave. And God says to the woman, he said, "I will surely multiply your pain in childbearing. In pain you shall bring forth children. Your desire shall be for your husband." So that is not the romantic desire or the sexual desire or the love commitment desire. This is the desire to control, to rule over, to manipulate the husband. And notice in response to that, he said, "And he shall rule over you." Same kind of structure. He will oppose you. He will push you off. He will dominate you. He will do what he can to stifle you. And that is the curse of the marriage bond now. Sin in the heart affects both the husband and the wife. And it's the same word. Like my picture? I love that picture. So how are we to act regarding desire or craving? How are we to deal with temptation? I always try to remind young people when they are in premarital counseling that you're going to take a vow at before God and these witnesses, and the vow says, "I take you. I, Dave, take you, Janet." And what you're really also saying is the inverse. I am deliberately rejecting every other woman in the world. Now that part is sometimes not understood in that vow, but that is clearly what's being said. And the implication is very important that both the husband and the wife, before they take that vow, they understand that. I take you and I reject all others. That's the implication there. And so, in a positive sense, the husband, when he goes into the world and he works alongside others, and in an office setting, he works alongside other attractive women who are trying to be attractive for their own purposes, he has to put blinders on his eyes. Metaphorically speaking, he's got to put blinders on his eyes, just like horses have blinders. The horses, the owners will put blinders on horses' eyes to keep them from being spooked by anything out here. And the husband needs to understand, every day he goes to work, he needs to have those blinders on, which reminds him of what? I am a sinful man. Sin resides in my heart. I'm going to be faced with temptation. How am I going to deal with it? Before it comes, I need to know how I'm going to deal with it. And that's where important aspects of behavior in the workplace come. Maintaining a distance, keeping a title before you, not allowing for fraternization at the water cooler. You have to. There has to be certain boundaries you are prepared to make, and even change if somebody's pursuing you, so that you remain safe, and that you are out of temptation. You have to deal with that. The man's got to have blinders on, and he go through it because he's being reminded. I am a married man. I wear a wedding ring. Everywhere I go, I represent my wife. And I have to tell people that all the time. It's always a good thing, and I try to tell this to young marrieds too, you know, and that you've lived so long by yourselves. And you're used to making impulsive decisions on the spot because you're only dealing with yourself. You want to go to a party tonight? Let's go to the bar tonight. Okay, no problem. You know, you want to do it. Said when you get married, there's the other person that has to be brought into the situation. And you know, I try to teach husbands. I said your new response to any invitation now is, I have to check with my wife first. I have to check with my wife first. I have to check with my wife first. My son Matthew got real good at that. You could ask him, what time is it? I have to check with my wife first. He was great. He was great. So the commandment says you are not to covet your neighbor's wife. Temptation, of course, is there in the sin of the heart, but it also can come out of a marriage that is not perfect, because no marriage is perfect, and every marriage is rocky and has its moments and needs to grow through those moments. You know, in our world view today, people are all too ready to call it quits because they just don't think they're compatible. But Christ calls them to work through those things, and it's important that they take that challenge and learn to trust God and not trust one another. That itself is a very important growth period. But temptation can come especially out of discontent. Had a fight with my wife this morning. All right, so now I've got a bad attitude, and so I'm going to lower my guard without even knowing it. You know, this woman at work, she's very friendly, and my wife just bit my head off before I left the house, and it's just I get a little bit of warm fuzzy, and that's, you know, as far as it goes and everything. But my temptation leads to discontent. I'm not getting affection at home, and so I'm getting innocent affection here, and that's what's wrong with that. And so we open ourselves up. We open the doors up, and when we do that, it leads to infatuation. We study that other woman, and we say, "Boy, you know that she's kind of nice, and she's got all things. I should have married her." You know. All our ducks are in a row. She's with it. She's sharp. She's beautiful, and all these other things. It leads to an infatuation, and all you're thinking of is the other woman. And when you do that, of course, what are the signs of that? The signs of that is you're abandoning your priorities. You're of loyalty to God. You become the man with building the bigger barns. You're only thinking of yourself. And so as a result of that, the priorities you are supposed to be maintaining in your life are beginning to diminish. Because remember, what you worship requires your time and your effort and your money, and it consumes you. And so now if you're infatuated with this inappropriate relationship over here, you're giving all of your time, effort, money over to this, and it's consuming you, and you're leaving your God-given priorities at home. What that does is that puts a new set of blinders on your eyes. Now you're infatuated with this woman, with this man, with whoever. And this is all you can see. This is a different set of blinders. This is not the blinders of protection. This is the blinders of temptation. And the way temptation works is that it makes you, like I said, it consumes you. It makes all you can see is that woman. All you can see is this prize. All you're thinking about is this. And because you have those blinders on, you don't see everything else that's going on and developing in your world. And You go from dreaming to planning, you plot, you envision a profitable outcome. You think, oh, surely if I run away with this woman, everything's going to be great. It's just, everything's going to work out fine, and everything's just going to be wonderful. And you cannot see those unavoidable consequences. And when you give in to the temptation, when you plan, and then when you act on the plan, it's when you act on the plan that the Holy Spirit rips those blinders off, and all of a sudden you see everything. You see how devastating your life has become. You see what damage you have done. You see how terrible your life is going to be now. It's all the things you couldn't see before, and now you see everything, and it's going to be very ugly. So that's a little application of what that means. So what's the alternative to that? The larger catechism helps us in this. Paul tells us we are to learn how to be content. And that is such a wonderful challenge, because being content is not something that most of us are gifted with. It is an art. It is an art form. It is something we work at. It is something we develop. Battling temptation is one of the ways we learn to be content. The larger catechism says, what are the sins that are forbidden in the 10th commandment? And he says the sins forbidden in the 10th commandment are discontent with our own estate, envying, grieving at the good of our neighbor, together with all inordinate motions and affections to anything that is his. Just simply discontent in our heart and soul. I want what he's got. I want to be where he is. And scriptures to reinforce that. I won't have time to read them right now. But then there's also, for all the negatives, for all the ways that the commandments tell us not to do something. And remember, I want you to remember the image of that infant reaching up to the pan on the stove. This isn't just simply now y'all. God's not saying y'all need to keep focused on your own wives and husbands. It's better if you do that. He's saying don't touch the stove. This is important. He's really driving it home. And it's for our good. It's not just God, lowering the boom and being all holy and everything. He's trying to tell us what is right. Don't touch the stove. And he's got real reasons for wanting you to understand that. So what are the duties required in the 10th commandment? There's always the positive side. There's always the side that says, what God wants us to do, as opposed to what he doesn't want us to do. And he says the duties required in the 10th commandment are such a full contentment with our own condition. And again, that's not just something that's not going to come to you. You're not just going to wake up and say, I'm content. Why? Because you still got sin in the heart. That sin in the heart's got to be dealt with. You can't just go off and join a commune and say, I don't have sin in my heart anymore. That sin's got to be dealt with, and you do it by putting those blinders on and by living according to the Word of God and honoring Him in everything you do. But you also have to discipline your own mind to say, I will be content with what God gives me. Not what I've gotten, not the kingdom I've built, but what God has given me. I will be content. Content with our own condition and such a charitable frame of soul toward our neighbor. I mentioned before that the giving to God is one of the ways we recognize whether we're serving money or God, is we make sure our money serves God. And the same way as we measure whether we're devoting ourselves to God in terms of society is whether we're compassionate to our neighbor. If the Lord tells us to leave for the poor so that they can productively work to their own effort, we need to do that in business. Today that's hard to do. The boss wants you to squeeze every last dollar, and there has to be some alternative by way of charitable giving or offering some help and assistance in some way. And that our inward motions and affections touching Him tend unto and further all the good which is His. So the commandment, like all of the commandments, are dealing with our neighbor. And we are not to covet But instead, we are to help. We are to minister to. We are to lift up. We are to encourage our neighbor. So there's the negative, don't touch the stove, and there's the positive, feed from the stove, if you will. And so godliness with contentment is great gain, and Philippians 4, I have learned whatever situation I am to be content. A learning process for us all. Okay, any questions? Yes?
Just a comment, so the, couple of slides aren't in this thing.
Right.
Can I have a receipt
No, all right.
for the communal versus the biblical?
Yeah.
Because we discuss that a lot in our house, and it would just be helpful.
You discuss everything in your house. I think that's good. That's good. Yes, sir.
So, with the contentment situation part, does that mean saying you're really just contented with your job? Do you have to be content with your job and not try to get another job?
No, that's not the same thing. You are to be advancing yourself and being diligent with what you can be, and you are to pursue what is an exercising dominion in your particular circumstance. To be content with one particular situation could be just simple enslavement or laziness. You say, well, I like this job, I've had it, I don't think I'm going to, I could do better over there, but I'm not going to bother. There's a laziness in that. But we are to be productive, and that will lead us to more and more responsibility. You know, the parable of the talents. Take what, the one who brings 5 talents is given more. To whom has will be given more, and so your responsibility grows as you get older and more mature. Yes, Martha.
I think as a couple, the man who's working and has responsibilities at work and has a job, has a title,
Right?
has a particular kind of job he does well, he should be inspired
Mm-hmm.
by his wife
Oh yeah, yeah. Supported by his wife.
to, and apply some of the things he knows from how he treats his wife to how he treats his co-workers.
Mm-hmm. He should have it all. He should not leave his wife behind.
That's
It should be all-encompassing. Very good point, yes. Always, you're a married man, you're a married woman, in whatever part of life you are. That's the first thing that people should know about you. That's the argument, by the way. I know this is, maybe I'm raising hackles, but that's the argument, by the way, for referring to a woman as Mrs. man's name, first name, second name, Mrs. David Barker. You know, some people say, well, that's too formal. I can't do that. But that's the argument for doing that, is you're putting that, the husband is there, and Mrs. is good enough, I think, but that's where that comes from. So, okay, let's pray.